What if you stepped out your front door for a 5-minute errand and simply vanished into thin air? On a bitter, cold Sunday evening in January 1994, Stephen Asplund left his best friend's house with a borrowed caulking gun in hand. He was going home, just 5 minutes away to continue renovating the house where he and his fiancée would soon begin their married life together. He was wearing his favorite Chicago Bears jacket. His wedding was just months away. He never made it home. Within hours, Steve's black Ford Mustang would be found abandoned by the Mississippi River, 3 miles from his house. But Steve had disappeared without a trace. For 28 years, his family would search. It would walk miles of riverbanks in snow and rain. They would follow every lead, chase every rumor, cling to every shred of hope. And all the while, hundreds of miles downstream, an unidentified body lay buried in a St. Louis cemetery, its secrets locked away by a simple database error. This is the story of Stephen Asplund. A story about the cruel mathematics of coincidence. About the thin line between being here and being gone. About a family's unbreakable devotion and a detective who refused to give up. This is a story where the ending was written in 1994, but nobody could read it until 22-2. Stephen Robert Asplund. Everyone called him Steve. Was born on July 28, 1961, in Moline, Illinois. He grew up in the heart of the Quad Cities, that cluster of communities straddling the mighty Mississippi River where Illinois meets Iowa. Steve had a twin sister and an older brother named Mike, and together they formed a tight-knit family that would remain close throughout their lives. By 1994, Steve was 32 years old and working as a tool and die maker, skilled, precise work that required both physical strength and meticulous attention to detail. It was honest, hard-working Midwestern labor, the kind that built the backbone of American manufacturing. Steve was good at his job, reliable. It's the kind of guy who showed up on time and did what he said he would do. But work wasn't everything to Steve. He had dreams. He had plans. Steve was engaged to be married to a woman named Judy. The wedding was planned for later in 1994. It's just a few months away from that January evening when everything changed. Together, they were renovating Steve's residence in the 1500 block of 28th Avenue in Moline, in the Prospect Park area. They were building their future, literally, one room at a time. Mike Asplund, Steve's older brother, would later remember his little brother with evident fondness. The family gatherings, the holidays, the ordinary moments that become precious only after they're gone. Their mother, Muriel, and Steve's twin sister lived nearby in Bettendorf. This was home. This was where Steve belonged. Steve wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks. He wasn't reckless or impulsive. Friends and family described him as dependable, the kind of person you could count on. The kind of person who doesn't just vanish. But on January 9, 1994, that's exactly what Steve Asplund did. Or rather, that's what appeared to happen. The truth, as it turned out, was far more tragic than anyone could have imagined. And the answer to what happened to Steve Asplund had been lying in plain sight for nearly 3 decades, hidden by a twist of fate so mundane. It's almost cruel. The winter of 1994 was brutal in the Midwest. The weather was bitterly cold with a lot of snow, the kind of January that makes you question why anyone lives this far north. The Mississippi River, that great artery of American commerce and history, was partially frozen, its dark waters churning beneath sheets of ice. But inside homes across Moline, life went on. People made plans. They worked on projects. They looked forward to better weather and brighter days ahead. For Steve Asplund, this Sunday was just another day in the ongoing renovation project. He was working on remodeling his house, preparing it for the life he would soon share with his fiancée, Judy. The work was coming along, but like any home renovation, there were always things you needed, tools you didn't have. supplies that ran out. That afternoon, Steve realized he needed a caulking gun. It's such a mundane detail, isn't it? A caulking gun. Not a dramatic catalyst for tragedy. Just a simple tool needed for a simple task. The kind of thing you borrow from a friend without a second thought. Steve knew exactly where to get one. His best friend, Tim Miner, lived nearby in the 500 block of 20th Avenue, in the area of 4th Street. It was close, just about 5 minutes away by car. Steve had been to Tim's house countless times before. Around 7 p.m., Steve climbed into his black 1987 Ford Mustang and drove to Tim Miner's house. It was already dark winter darkness that comes early and stays late. The temperature was below freezing. When Steve arrived at Tim's house, they didn't just quickly exchange the tool and part ways. They hung out for a while, talking, catching up, the kind of casual conversation between old friends that doesn't seem important at the time. Maybe they talked about Steve's upcoming wedding. Maybe they discussed the renovation project. Maybe they just shot the breeze about nothing in particular. Nobody who was there that evening could have known they were witnessing Stephen Asplund's final moments in the world of the living. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Steve collected the red caulking gun and said his goodbyes. He walked out to his Mustang, probably thinking about the work he could finish that evening. About Judy waiting at home, about the wedding just months away. Steve was wearing a t-shirt, his Chicago Bears jacket, gray sweatpants, and white tennis shoes, Satonic sneakers. Comfortable clothes for a quick errand on a cold night. Tim Miner watched as Steve's Mustang pulled away, heading east from his residence. The taillights disappeared into the winter darkness. The drive from Tim's house to Steve's home was only about 5 minutes, a short distance in familiar territory. But Steve Asplund never arrived home. What happened in those next minutes remains, in many ways, a mystery. We know the destination Steve intended to reach. We know he never got there. What we don't know, what we may never fully understand, is the why did Steve decide to take a different route home? Did something catch his attention? Did he remember another errand he needed to run? Or did something go terribly, suddenly wrong? Later that same evening, Steve's black Mustang would be discovered 3 miles from his home. But by then, precious hours would have already passed. When Steve hadn't returned home by 6 a.m. the next morning, Judy began searching for him. This wasn't like Steve. He was reliable, predictable. If he was going to be late, he would call. If plans changed, he would communicate. But there had been no call, no message, no Steve. Judy's concern quickly escalated to alarm. By mid-morning on January 10, 1994, she reported Steve missing to the Moline Police Department. The nightmare had begun. When the Moline Police Department received Judy's missing person report, they moved quickly. A 32-year-old man doesn't just disappear without a trace in a small city like Moline. There had to be an explanation. Steve's family, his brother Mike, his mother Muriel, his twin sister all mobilized immediately. Mike Asplund would later recall, "We knew something was up, was wrong, pretty much immediately. Very uncharacteristic. They started looking right away. But where do you even begin when someone vanishes between 2 points just 5 minutes apart?" Within days of Steve's disappearance, reports vary between the same day and a week later, police located his black 1987 Ford Mustang in Bettendorf, Iowa. The car was found at Leech Park, in a parking lot at the 13th Street landing at the base of the Interstate 74 bridge. Let that sink in for a moment. Bettendorf is across the Mississippi River from Moline, connected by the I-74 bridge. Steve's car wasn't found on his route home. It wasn't found broken down on the side of the road. It was found parked, deliberately, in a location that made no sense given Steve's intended destination. Police immediately processed the vehicle for evidence. Items of evidence were recovered. from the car and analyzed in 1994 through fingerprint examination. Several items were found inside: the red caulking gun Steve had borrowed, cigarette butts, and strands of hair. Examinations conducted in 1994 showed that all DNA evidence inside the vehicle belonged to either Steve or his fiancée Judy. There was no sign of anyone else. No sign of a struggle. No sign of foul play. But there was also no sign of Steve Q. Police searched the water near where the Mustang was found, looking for a body. They found nothing. Word spread quickly through Moline. A local man engaged to be married, renovating his home, with his whole future ahead of him, had simply vanished. Search parties formed. Volunteers scoured the Mississippi River banks, Arsenal Island, Credit Island, Big Island, Sunset Marina. Mike Aspland would later remember those early searches. Sometimes there were 20 to 30 people searching. But then, sometimes there were searches where maybe there were 4 of us. The weather at that time was a lot like it is this year. It was really cold, and there was a lot of snow. They searched in brutal conditions. They searched until their fingers went numb and their voices grew hoarse from calling Steve's name. They searched because Steve was one of their own, and in a place like Moline, you don't abandon your own. But the Mississippi River in winter is vast and unforgiving. It keeps its secrets. Several months after Steve's disappearance, in August 1994, a hiker made a strange discovery at Loud Thunder Forest Preserve in Rock Island County. Steve's medical insurance card was found sitting on the rail of a footbridge. This discovery reignited hope and terror in equal measure. Was Steve alive? Had he been there recently? Or had someone else placed it there? Police searched the river below the footbridge for Steve's body, but found no evidence relevant to the case. They stated they thought the card had been deliberately placed on the rail, perhaps by someone who found it elsewhere and innocently set it there. But why would Steve's insurance card end up at Loud Thunder, miles from where his car was found? The question hung in the air. Unanswered. One tip that came in during 1994 involved a possible witness. C. Bearded man with a tattoo of the letters HR on the back of his left hand, who wore a Green Bay Packers jacket. This individual had supposedly been seen with Steve at a tavern on 7th Street in Moline. For years, investigators sought this man. He was finally identified in January 2014, but after an extensive investigation, it was determined he had never met Steve, never drank with him. And the lead was found to be not credible. Another dead end in those first months and years after Steve vanished. The Moline Police Department pursued every lead with determination. Steve worked for a local tool and die maker, and investigators looked into his employment, his relationships, his finances. They found nothing suspicious. Since his disappearance, Steve had not used his credit cards or withdrawn any money from his bank account. There was no indication he had planned to disappear. No evidence of financial troubles. No sign of personal crisis. Judy, Steve's fiancée, was not considered a suspect in the case. The couple had been happily planning their wedding. There was no history of domestic violence, no motive, no evidence pointing toward her involvement. The forensic evidence from the Mustang was puzzling precisely because there wasn't much of it. Everything found in the car belonged to either Steve or Judy, exactly what you'd expect in a car regularly driven by an engaged couple. There was no blood, no sign of violence, no indication of a crime, but the location of the car. That was the mystery that gnawed at investigators. Why would Steve park his car by the Mississippi River in Bettendorf when he was heading home to Moline? The I-74 bridge parking lot wasn't on his route. It wasn't a place Steve regularly visited. It made no sense unless Steve had gone there deliberately. But why? In 2012, the items of evidence recovered from Steve's Mustang, the cigarette butts and strands of hair, were sent to the Illinois State Police Crime Lab for processing. Technology had advanced significantly since 1994. What had been inconclusive in the 90s might yield answers in the 2010s. In 2014, the evidence was examined again by DNA analysis. All evidence was found to belong to Steve or his fiancée. The advanced testing confirmed what the 1994 analysis had suggested. There was no third party involved. No unknown perpetrator. No obvious crime. The case went cold again. Not for lack of effort, but for lack of answers. While the official investigation stalled, the Asplund family never stopped searching. Mike Asplund made it a point to never focus on any one theory. "I didn't want to rule out anything," he said. He and other family members continued to walk the riverbanks, to follow up on rumors, to keep Steve's case in the public eye. Mike, who worked as a technology director for East Moline School, District 37, balanced his professional life with the ongoing search for his brother. "You just have moments where you think about it more," he said. "It's rough during those times. Whenever the family gets together around the holidays, birthdays, you think more about him." Their mother, Muriel, struggled deeply with Steve's disappearance. "My mom couldn't really deal with it at the time," Mike recalled. "It has gotten a little better over the years." 20 years passed. Then the family held on to hope, but that hope grew more fragile with each passing year. By 2014, Mike Asplund reflected, "There's been a lot of hope and prayers that things would happen, that we'd hear something. It would be great if Steve was out there. I think in today's computerized society, if that were the case, we would have heard something by now. I would like some kind of closure." In November 2021, nearly 28 years after Steve Asplund vanished, Moline Police Department Detective Mike Griffin made a decision that would finally break the case wide open. Griffin wasn't new to the case, he'd worked on it before. But he approached it with fresh eyes and a methodical strategy that would prove crucial. Griffin researched the National Missing and Unidentified System NamUs database for recovered unidentified remains along the Mississippi River from Moline all the way down to Memphis, Tennessee. He was working backwards geographically, and he focused on a time frame of 1994-1996, the years immediately following Steve's disappearance. The Mississippi River is enormous. It flows through or borders 10 states. Bodies that enter the river can travel hundreds of miles, carried by current, potentially catching on barges or other river traffic. If Steve had somehow ended up in the river in Bettendorf, where his car was found, there was no telling where his body might have eventually surfaced. Griffin worked methodically, searching through database entries, comparing details, looking for anything that might match Steve's description, and then he found it. Body had been recovered in St. Louis County, Missouri, on March 21, 1994, just weeks after Steve disappeared. The entry described a male white body wearing gray sweatpants and white shoes. Steve had last been seen wearing gray sweatpants and white Etonic sneakers. The location made sense too. Griffin theorized that if Steve had entered the water in Bettendorf on the night of January 9, 1994, his body could have gotten entangled with a barge and been transported downriver to the St. Louis County area. The timeline fit. The clothing matched. The circumstances were consistent. But there was a problem. The database entry included a dental discrepancy that had previously misled investigators. Dental records are often the gold standard for identification when DNA isn't available. If the dental records didn't match, most investigators would move on to the next lead. But Detective Griffin, Biggie give up that easily. In 2022, Griffin contacted Dr. Lindsay Trammell, a forensic anthropologist with the St. Louis County Medical Examiner's Office, about the case. Together with the investigative team, they reviewed every detail, compared every piece of information, tried to account for the discrepancy. After exhausting all efforts, the team determined they had to exhume the body for further examination. It was a difficult decision. Exhumation is expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally fraught. But if there was even a chance, this was Steve Asplund. The family deserved to know. On June 8, 2022, the unidentified remains were exhumed from Frieden Cemetery in St. Louis, and a bone sample was obtained from the remains. The bone sample, along with familial DNA samples from Steve's family, were submitted to the Illinois State Police Crime Lab and processed by forensic scientist Aaron Small. Then came the wait. DNA analysis takes time, and the Asplund family had already been waiting for 28 years. What were a few more weeks? On September 6, 2022, after completion of processing by the Illinois State Police, it was determined that the unidentified remains located in St. Louis County on March 21, 1994, were those of Stephen Asplund. Missing from Moline on January 9, 1994. After 10,467 days, 28 years, 7 months, and 28 days, the Asplund family finally had their answer. Steve's body had been found just weeks after he went missing. He had been lying in a cemetery in St. Louis for nearly 3 decades while his family searched and wondered and hoped. All because of a database discrepancy. All because the systems designed to connect missing persons with unidentified remains had failed in this one crucial instance. For 28 years. The question of what happened to Steve Asplund generated numerous theories. Some believed he was murdered. Others thought he'd run away to start a new life. Some suspected suicide. Now, with the identification of his remains and the determination of cause of death, we can evaluate these theories against what we know. Before the remains were identified, both authorities and Steve's brother Mike believed foul play was involved in the case. This wasn't mere speculation. There were legitimate reasons to suspect something sinister. The location of Steve's car was suspicious. Why would he drive to Bettendorf Park by the river and then vanish? The discovery of his insurance card at Loud Thunder Forest Preserve months later added another layer of mystery. Had someone taken Steve there? Was the card planted as a false lead? Family members expressed suspicions that Steve may have been murdered prior to his identification. The fact that no one could explain the simple gap between leaving Tim Miner's house and disappearing seemed to point toward something criminal. However, when Steve's remains were finally identified, investigators stated there was no indication of foul play in his death, and they believe he drowned after either accidentally or intentionally going into the water. No charges are being sought. The St. Louis County Medical Examiner's Office determined in 1994 that the cause of death was drowning. There were no signs of trauma on the body that would indicate violence before death. So why did Steve's car end up in Bettendorf if he wasn't meeting someone with ill intent? We'll address that question. But the physical evidence clearly indicates that murder was not what happened to Steve Asplund. Some people wondered if Steve had chosen to disappear to start over somewhere new, leaving his old life behind. This theory had several problems. First, Steve had not used his credit cards or withdrawn any money from his bank account since his disappearance. In modern society, it's nearly impossible to disappear and survive without accessing financial resources. Second, Steve was engaged to be married. He was in the middle of renovating his home. These aren't the actions of someone planning to vanish. These are the actions of someone building a future. Third, Steve was close to his family. The family remained tight-knit, gathering for holidays and birthdays. Would Steve really abandon his twin sister, his brother, his mother, and his fiancée without a word? The discovery of Steve's remains definitively rules out this theory. Steve didn't run away. He died within weeks of his disappearance. Police now believe Steve likely entered the water on the night of January 9, 1994, in Bettendorf. His body likely got entangled with a barge and was transported downriver to St. Louis County. but was entering the water an accident. Let's consider the possibilities. Steve's car was found parked at a landing by the river. In the brutal cold of January 1994, with ice forming on the Mississippi, what would bring Steve to that location? One possibility, Steve stopped for some reason, perhaps to look at the river, perhaps to think, perhaps simply to take a moment before going home. In the dark and the cold, with ice and snow on the ground, he could have slipped and fallen into the frigid water. The Mississippi River in January is deadly. The water temperature would have been near freezing. Steve had a heart condition, though it's not clear if this played a role in his death. But even a healthy person would quickly succumb to hypothermia in those conditions. If Steve did fall in accidentally, his chances of survival would have been measured in minutes. The current would have pulled him under. The cold would have stolen his strength. The darkness would have hidden him from any potential rescuers. This scenario is plausible, but it doesn't fully explain why Steve drove to that location in the first place. This is the most painful theory to discuss, but we must address it honestly. Investigators believe Steve drowned after either accidentally or intentionally going into the water. That word intentionally is important. It's the careful language investigators use when they can't or won't rule out suicide, but also can't definitively prove it. Why might investigators consider this possibility? Steve drove to a specific location by the river and then ended up in the water. There's no evidence anyone else was with him. The car wasn't crashed or damaged, it was parked, suggesting Steve had control of his vehicle and his actions. But against this theory, you must consider Steve's life circumstances. He was engaged. He was preparing for his wedding. He was renovating his home. These are future-oriented actions, not the behavior typically associated with someone planning to end their life. Steve did have a heart condition. Could he have received bad news about his health? Could he have been struggling with something he hadn't shared with his family or fiancé? We simply don't know. And perhaps we never will. Here's another possibility that deserves consideration. What if Steve experienced a medical emergency while driving? Steve had suffered from a heart condition, although it has not been specified whether it played a role in his death. Imagine this scenario. Steve is driving home from Tim Miner's house. He experiences chest pain, difficulty breathing, symptoms of a heart attack. He pulls over not at home where he could get help, but at the nearest place he can safely stop, which happens to be the river, landing in Bettendorf. In distress, disoriented, possibly experiencing cardiac symptoms. He gets out of the car. He stumbles. He falls into the water. This theory would explain why his car was found at that particular location. It wasn't his destination, but rather where he had to stop. It would explain the lack of defensive wounds or signs of struggle. It would explain why there was no evidence of anyone else being involved. The problem with this theory is that we'll never know for certain the condition of Steve's remains after weeks in the river and 28 years in the ground makes determining whether a cardiac event preceded or caused the drowning nearly impossible. Weighing all the evidence, here's what seems most probable, for reasons we may never fully understand, whether due to a medical issue, a moment of personal crisis, or simply a tragic accident. Steve ended up at the river, landing in Bettendorf on the night of January 9, 1994. He either fell or entered the water, where the freezing temperatures and strong current quickly led to his drowning. His body likely became entangled with a barge and was carried downstream, traveling approximately 250 miles to St. Louis County, Missouri, where it was found by dock workers on March 21, 1994. Police do not suspect foul play and are not seeking charges against anyone. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Steve's body was found relatively quickly, within weeks of his disappearance, but due to the condition of the remains and a discrepancy in the database system. He couldn't be identified for 28 years. The Asplund family spent nearly 3 decades wondering, searching and hoping, while Steve lay in an unmarked grave in St. Louis, waiting to be brought home. On Monday, September 12, 2022, Moline Police Chief Darren Gault held a press conference at 3:30 p.m. to announce that the remains of Steve Asplund had been identified. Detective Mike Griffin provided details on the cold case. Investigation during the news conference that the Asplund family did not attend the news conference but provided a statement through Steve's brother, Mike Asplund. The news, while bittersweet, will allow us some closure. Thanks to all the media for shining light on Steve's disappearance today. And over the past 29 years, the statement continued. Expressing gratitude to the investigators thanks to the Moline Police Department, St. Louis County Medical Examiner's Office, Dr. Lindsay Trammell and forensic scientist Aaron Small from the Illinois State Police. Without their assistance, we might never have known what happened. Their work will allow us to bring Steve back home, and we thank you for that. The Moline Police Department posted an emotional letter to Steve on the department's Facebook page, a testament to the dedication of the officers who never stopped searching for him. The letter read in part, "We promised your family and friends that we would never give up. We asked the community to never give up. We now know what happened, though we may never know why it happened. We will bring you home soon, and you'll get to rest where your family wants you to. They will be able to visit you, and every night they will now know where you are. Even at the darkest times, with seemingly no investigative leads to follow, we never gave up. May your soul finally rest at peace. Steve." The department noted they had spent 10,467 days looking for you and looking for answers following Steve's 1994 disappearance. At the time of the announcement, Steve's remains were buried in Frieden Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. The Moline Police Department was working with the family to make arrangements for Steve's final resting place. After 28 years, Steve Asplund would finally come home to the Quad Cities to be laid to rest where his family could visit him, where he belonged. When Detective Mike Griffin went to the Asplund family with the news that Steve had been found, he got a hug. It was a moment that captured the bond between investigators and the families. They serve a moment of shared grief and relief after nearly 3 decades of uncertainty. Chief Gault said of Griffin during the news conference, "He did not give up. Even when the initial review appeared, this body wasn't Mr. Asplund. He works hard for the community he serves, and we are lucky to have him on our team." Griffin's methodical search of the NamUs database, his refusal to accept the dental discrepancy as the final word, and his persistence in pursuing exhumation and DNA testing, these actions finally gave the Asplund family the answers they deserved. Chief Gault used the announcement to highlight other unsolved cases in Moline. While this concludes the investigation into the disappearance of Stephen Asplund, the work of the Moline Police Department continues in serving the community. We still search for answers in cases such as Trudy Appleby, who went missing in 1996, Jerry Woking, who went missing in 1990, Baby September, an infanticide from 1993, and Corey Harold Jr., who was murdered in 2018. The Moline Police Department will continue to investigate these cases. Regardless of time passing, the resolution of Steve's case offers hope to other families still waiting for answers. It demonstrates that cold cases can be solved, that advances in technology and databases can provide breakthroughs, and that dedicated investigators who refuse to give up can make a difference. It's important to note that closure, when it finally comes, is rarely the relief we imagine it to be. The Asplund family now has answers. Yes, they know what happened to Steve. They know where he is. They can visit his grave, but they also have To live with new pain the knowledge that Steve died alone in freezing water just weeks after he disappeared. The understanding that his body was found relatively quickly but lay unidentified for 28 years. The heartbreak of knowing that all those years of searching, all those walks along the riverbank, all those hopes that maybe Steve was still alive, somewhere was all for naught because Steve had been gone since January 1994. Sadly, Mike Asplund, Steve's devoted older brother who spent nearly 3 decades searching for him and advocating for his case, passed away on November 3, 2023, just 14 months. After finally learning what happened to his little brother, Mike was preceded in death by his brother Steven Asplund. In Mike's obituary, his family chose quotes from Disney that reflected his character. "Laughter is timeless. Imagination has no age. Dreams are forever, and Ohana means family. And family means no one gets left behind or forgotten." Mike Asplund never gave up on Steve. He kept his brother's memory alive. He pushed for answers. And in the end, got to know the truth before he died. The case of Steven Asplund teaches us several important lessons. First, the importance of comprehensive and accurate databases cannot be overstated. A dental discrepancy in the NamUs database entry initially misled investigators, preventing Steve's identification for 28 years. As these systems improve and become more interconnected, more families will hopefully receive the answers the Asplunds waited so long for. Second, persistence matters. Detective Griffin could have accepted the dental discrepancy and moved on to other leads. Instead, he kept digging, kept questioning, and ultimately ordered the exhumation that solved the case. Third, even in death, dignity matters. For 28 years, Steve Asplund was listed in databases as UP5306, an unidentified person, a case number, a mystery. Now he has his name back. He's no longer an unidentified body. He's Stephen Robert Asplund, a tool and die maker, a son, a brother, a twin, a fiancé, a friend. A man who mattered. A man who was loved. A man whose family never stopped looking for him. We will likely never know with absolute certainty why. Steve drove to that river, landing on January 9, 1994. Was it an accident? A medical emergency? A moment of crisis we can't understand from this distance. The physical evidence can tell us how Steve died drowning in the Mississippi River, but it can't tell us the why. Perhaps, in the end, the why doesn't matter as much as we think it does. What matters is that Steve Asplund has been found. What matters is that his family knows the truth. What matters is that Steve can finally rest in peace, surrounded by those who loved him and never gave up on him. Stephen Robert Asplund was 32 years old when he vanished on January 9, 1994. He was young, with his whole life ahead of him. He had dreams of marriage, of building a home with the woman he loved, of ordinary happiness. That January evening was supposed to be unremarkable, just a quick trip to borrow a tool from a friend. 5 minutes there, 5 minutes back. And then back to the renovation project that represented his future. But somewhere between 7:30 p.m. on January 9th and 6:00 a.m. on January 10th, everything went wrong in ways we may never fully understand. For 10,467 days, 28 years, 7 months, and 28 days Steve's family searched. They walked miles in freezing cold and summer heat. They followed every lead, no matter how tenuous. They held on to hope even when hope seemed foolish. They kept Steve's memory alive when it would have been easier to accept that he was gone forever. And in the end, their persistence, combined with advances in technology and the dedication of investigators who never gave up, brought Steve home. This is the story of Steven Asplund, not just a missing person case or a cold case solved, not just a database entry or a set of unidentified remains. This is the story of a man who was loved, who is remembered, who mattered. May he rest in peace. Don't let another family wait. 28 years. This documentary was created with the deepest respect for Steven Asplund and his family. Sources for this video include official police reports from the Moline Police Department, news coverage from local and national media outlets, and the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System NamUs database. Special recognition must be given to Detective Mike Griffin of the Moline Police Department, whose dedication and persistence finally brought Steve home. To Dr. Lindsay Trammell of the St. Louis County Medical Examiner's Office and forensic scientist. Aaron Small of the Illinois State Police, whose expertise made identification possible. And to the Asplund family, who never gave up hope and kept Steve's memory alive for nearly 3 decades. This video is dedicated to the memory of Steven Robert Asplund. July 28, 1961, January 9, 1994. And his brother Michael Everett Asplund. June 16, 1959, November 3, 2023, who never stopped searching for him. May they both rest in peace.